Hello guys, my name is Anna and I vlog daily from Ukraine, and also I invite people I respect, people I follow to my YouTube channel for serious conversations. And today I am extremely honored to talk with Vlad Vexler, whom I follow actively for more than a year, and I know that many of you watch him and include your quotations, Vlad, in the comments below some of my videos. And I can introduce you as a truly global modern philosopher and a guide. You explain complicated things in very vivid illustrations, and personally, with your help, I have changed a couple of my opinions, which is rare. And also, you are kind of person I can talk to, quarrel with, without your actual presence, which I think is a part of a genius. Only with popular authors, with really interesting thinkers, we can develop this internal conversation and hold them for a pretty long period of time. So I'm very happy to meet you on the channel and to have this real conversation with you.
Good to be with you.
I actually planned our talk to be in two parts. I would like to switch to this second part of our conversation and to take more focus on Russia and Ukraine in particular. And you are a unique person from this perspective because you are outside the system, and to some extent, for example, for me being in Ukraine, sometimes it's difficult to analyze, was it a success or a failure of my country, because I'm emotional, I'm into events and so on. So being outside the system, you observe, but at the same time you possess the needed receptors to feel this part of the world. So do you feel, but I think you do, but how do you feel Ukrainian and then Russian society, population changed during this war, if these changes are already visible? In Ukraine and then in Russia, or whatever you feel it.
I think the most striking thing is the grassroots consolidation in Ukraine. I think the coming together of that sense of civic belonging that in the end makes a functional state a state is what's been happening for years in Ukraine, but it became palpable and was dramatically consolidated by the invasion. The difficult part is that some of the consolidation that Ukraine has gone through has been predicated on a short to medium term victorious war. And if this war drags on for years, the nature of that consolidation will have to both relax a bit, but also change. And that's going to be, I think, for me, a more complex and a more challenging transformation than even perhaps adjusting to the war. Because there was so much that was inevitable about how you reacted to the war. I mean, what are you going to do if a country invades you and says you don't exist, right? You're going to come together. So one of the things that we're going to have to witness is a kind of implicit conversation between Ukrainian society and their government and within Ukrainian society about what one should say, what one should do, what one should feel, if this is not a highly intense concentration of all energies for 18 months to expel an invasion, but a conflict that could last 3 or 4 more years. So that's going to be an extraordinarily challenging time for Ukraine. And one of the things that makes it so challenging is not just uncertainty about the future vis-a-vis how the war will go, but uncertainty about the future in terms of how and in what way Ukraine might be welcomed into the West, into Western alliances and so on. So, you're fighting a fight, but you've not been, I'm not necessarily blaming the West entirely here, I'm just making a factual observation, but you've not been given a clear picture of where you're supposed to land, right? Where safety is and what it looks like. So I think this is going to be something that comes up much more over the next few months, unless there are phenomenal successes on the battlefield. In terms of Russia, obviously, your society becomes much, much more, I'm going to use a sort of unprofessional word, much more sick when you do what the Russian regime is doing. Russia is an increasingly difficult environment to negotiate. And the people in Russia who are opposed to the war, and we don't know how to count them, but let's say we're talking about support for the war is very low, in my opinion, positive support, but concrete constructive opposition is very low too. It's probably sort of under 20%. But these people feel that they don't have anywhere practical to take their position, to take their opposition to the war. And they are at risk of not just repressing things they think from coming out as words, but they're at risk of beginning to stop even thinking the things that they would freely think if they weren't there. So there's some real risks of cultural toxicity there. That is an inevitable byproduct of being stuck with a state that engages in such a brutal and outrageous war. One of the things that the regime has tried to do with one hand and tried to stop doing with the other is to quote-unquote fascicize society. And so far what we can observe is that has partly not been tried properly and partly has failed. In other words, the vast majority of Russians are still saying, go away from me with this bloody war you're doing. I have no idea why you're doing it. Please get away from me with it. So far that hasn't happened. And it seems to me one of the things that Putin is hoping for is that he might be able to get there 5 years from now. And that's one of the things that's palpable when you look at the transformation that the school system is undergoing in Russia. They're trying to almost bring up a generation ready for a large conflict against the West, when that generation, that's children now, they're children today, when they grow up. So there's a process of uncertain movement toward a politicization, a destructive politicization of the Russian population, what I've just called fascization. But the regime knows it can't pull that off at this point. So it's an extremely difficult place in which to find oneself, whatever one's dispositions are, and it'll only get worse. I think a lot of Russians speaking about whether people have woken up to this in various ways, and we're just saying how the West hasn't fully woken up to what the Kremlin's about. But I think the majority of the Russian population has not woken up to what's happening. They have not woken up to the extraordinary totalitarian turns that await them in the years to come unless this regime collapses. There is still this aspiration of going back to before the war started, hoping that the war somehow just stops. And unfortunately, here I have bad news for Russians. Everything that you are seeing now, the new levels of repression, new levels of instability in the regime's control over organized violence, all of the unloveliest things that Russians hope will pass them by, unfortunately, are going to inevitably magnify and dramatize until this regime collapses or until it is defeated.
You know, one of the arguments that we often hear from Russians who support, for example, Ukraine, they say that many are afraid to protest because many will die. And then when you look at the numbers of Russians who already died in this totally unnecessary war, these are hundreds of thousands who have already died. So sometimes this becoming active, becoming political can actually save you from dying. So feeling Russian depoliticized population, in one of your videos you spoke about this dilemma that Putin has encountered. Now to continue the war, he needs to politicize them back to make them active haters of Ukraine and collective West. And it's complicated. Do you feel that some positive change can come from Russia? Because like my dream as a Ukrainian, fast success of Ukrainian counteroffensive, cleaning all the territory, I realize there are lots of challenges. But can we look at this super optimistic scenario from the side of Russia? Do you feel any changes possible within their society that can lead to the collapse of Putin's regime? Do you see any visible opposition? I mean, like, not another imperial lighter version, but a more or less normal, if it's possible to say so, person, party that can work with the world, with the democratic world. The alternative, is there any visible alternative?
I think that the collapse of the Putin regime is a good thing at the level of both the destructiveness of the politics we're going to see in Russia that's going to emanate out of Russia into neighboring countries, but also at the level of nuclear risk. But that doesn't yet answer the question of how much better is what follows likely to be. Is it going to be something that has a remotely democratic shape or not? This is hard for me because what you say in politics is politics itself. So it's always important to speak constructively and aspirationally. But psychologically, I am not a Russian citizen. And so all of my political emotion is connected with the West. It's connected with Northern Europe or Western Europe. And so there's going to be an extraordinary transformation that Russia goes through when the Putin regime collapses, whose shape we don't know. So I don't want to sound too cold and distant, but it's true. I am not a Russian citizen. These are not sort of immediately emotionally heavy questions for me. But being empathetic, I would say this. The collapse of Putin's mode of imperialism is inevitable, partly just because it doesn't have enough to offer. It doesn't just have zero to offer Ukrainians except violence and destructiveness. It doesn't have anything to offer Russians either. Could the regime, the Putin regime collapsing, lead to a kind of feeling of national humiliation that leads to an extraordinary form of revanchist, resentment-driven violence that rises up again? I wouldn't rule it out, but we would be very unlucky to get that, because that's what we already have today. These things could conceivably happen twice in a row, but we would be spectacularly unlucky to get that. I think that what we are terribly worried about a defeated, humiliated Russia doing is already what Russia is doing today. So I'd be skeptical. I'd be skeptical that we're going to get 2.0 of the same thing. Now, how much better can it be? Is Russia capable of being a democratic republic? That's to say, not being in everywhere democracy the way Britain is, but having many features of a democratic society. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. But am I optimistic about this? No. But is it possible? Yes. And how likely it is to happen depends not just on Russians, but it also depends on us. It depends on, first of all, what happens in the war. A more comprehensive defeat for Russia is actually more conducive to positive democratic change. But it also depends on the strategy we adopt to what we expect to happen on that Russian space, right? Inevitably, we're going to be facing a situation where there's political change in Russia and they're asking for some sanctions to be removed. What are we open to exchanging that for, right? What do we tell Russian opposition now? So it's difficult to talk to the Russian opposition because they are disunited, and because they can't do much about getting rid of Putin at the moment, they're often engaging in various kinds of quarrels between themselves. But if we could engage with them in some kind of a unified way, what do we tell them? And we need to tell them things like, we don't love you doing this, but we love you doing that. We're supportive of you doing that. Do more of that, right? So that kind of constructive engagement from us is both possible and is genuinely effective at increasing the chance that Russia both gets another democratic opportunity and takes it. Now, you might say, if you're pessimistic, what's the point? Well, I believe that if you look at the, first of all, appalling destruction in Ukraine alone, then every percentage point matters. Every percentage point that increases the chances that Russia isn't going to invade anybody anymore, that increases the chances that what's happening on Russian territory is something that we can deal with, we can negotiate with, we can accept more. That makes a real difference. So that's why, in a certain sense, I think that political pessimism is has its limits, because you can always do 1 percentage point better, and we should be doing that. And that does not mean that we have to talk about oppositional forces in Russia or Russian opposition outside of Russia in terms of us liking them or not liking them. We have to talk about them in terms of us using them. Can they serve some kind of a purpose? If we find some shovels that look constructive, but they say things on them we don't like or that we find offensive and so on, we could use them. So these are the kinds of questions we've got to ask. Russia's most famous opposition politician, Mr. Navalny, the question is not, do you like him? The question is, he is a kind of a bomb under the Putin regime. Can you use him? I'm a British citizen, so my question is, can Mr. Navalny be useful for Britain and maybe for Ukraine? Useful for Britain in the sense that can we bring it about that Russia doesn't invade anybody and that Russia stops threatening the world with nuclear war, right? So the question with somebody like Mr. Navalny is he of any use to Ukraine? And the answer could be, he's completely useless. He does not help Ukraine achieve any of its strategic goals, therefore ignore him. Or it could be, yeah, he is useful. He is a kind of a threat to the Putin regime, and we could make something of that. We could engage with it. So that's politics, and I think we have to begin having a much more unsentimental political conversation about what's happening on Russian soil. And it's very much the responsibility of Western powers to get clearer about that, to minimize the chances of all kinds of ghastly things we've seen over recent history repeating themselves. But one thing that I think we can be fairly confident about is that while we don't know how many people's lives this imperial project will destroy, it will collapse eventually. It cannot sustain itself simply because it is so spectacularly poor at meeting people's political needs, at offering anything to anybody. The only way that doesn't happen is if Russia moves towards something like a North Korea dynamic of isolation and consolidation, and then this story holds up for a couple of decades. That's possible too, but this would be still just delaying something. But that doesn't mean that we have a solution now. But at the same time, we should do everything in our power to try to make it more likely. Any kind of politics that happens on that space is probably in our interest. Any kind of conflict, any kind of political life on that space might be to our advantage, and so we should be thinking of. We in the West certainly should be thinking of our relationship with Russia in the post-Putin world.
That's why I love watching you. You're able to transform my, for example, personal Ukrainian anger into something more rational, not focusing on some of Navalny's messages, for example, but visualizing him as an instrument to achieve my own selfish Ukrainian goals. And that's to some extent beautiful. I had a subscriber buying me coffee today with a message like, give up, Russia will win, Putin will nuke Kiev, and I had the feeling I want to return this money back or something, and then I decided to donate them to Ukrainian armed forces. And I think it's more rational, and it's even beautiful. And I informed him, you have just donated money to support Ukrainian armed forces.
Very good. Let me just say this quickly. Unconditional and unqualified rage at all things Russian for a Ukrainian is rational too. It might not be something that you want to take up all the space that there is in your head, but as one thing one feels, that is not irrational at all. It's what anybody would feel.
I agree, but it's extremely important to remain connected with the world, and not all are capable to understand that it's okay for a country at war to be at that level of hatred towards someone, because it can be seen as like you're becoming same as Russia or something. So I am trying to do something, and when you're doing something, you have to be reserved. That's why I learn a lot of this really educational things that your perspective gives, and how you actually can hurt this modern Russian regime more, being active, being normal, not being simply aggressive. And then maybe this one final question. I'm not going to ask you when and how it all will end, because we've just discussed the dynamics and unpredictability of war. And of course, it's not okay to give advice to a country. So I would like to ask you, just visualize it as a friend, as giving an advice to me. You've observed some mistakes of Ukraine, our society, maybe the way we communicate with the world, maybe something that you feel comfortable to talk about. What would you advise us to do at this moment in history, to use this moment in history more effectively for the victory and peace?
A boring and then a rather small scale answer, perhaps. The boring answer is that one has to make the case, if one is Ukrainian, about how Putin constitutes a threat to the West, and how supporting Ukraine, perhaps supporting Ukraine more, is in the West's strategic interests. And this is especially important at a time when there is some exhaustion that Western citizens are beginning to feel. It's just early days of that change, but there are some early signs of exhaustion with the Ukraine story in the West. And so at this point, it's very important to understand that the Putin regime threatens you, person in New York, you, person in Berlin and Paris. And you and I have had conversations about why that is, but I think it's important to make a strategic case. It's not just about Ukraine's trying to be a democracy. Can't you stop it from being invaded by this horrible imperialist monster? Well, they need to have a story about why to do that goes beyond just Ukraine's aspirations for sovereignty. If all one has are Ukraine's aspirations for freedom and sovereignty, that's not enough to sustain Western support. The second thing I would say is that as the war goes on, if the war goes on for a while longer, for years to come, for 2 or 3 years, I think it'll be very important in that period for Ukraine to not make its own conversation with itself too narrow and too defensively consolidated. Because at the time of war, what you understand to be national security, what you understand to be a threat to Ukraine's informational space, that can feel like something that is an absolutely urgent and uncompromising need, right? And of course it's a need when it comes to anything military or anything to do with the physical security of the state. But there is also a risk that some Ukrainians tell other Ukrainians that they're not saying exactly the right things about Ukraine's history or saying exactly the right things about Ukraine's decolonization. So I think it's important to have a democratic public sphere. And having a democratic public sphere is really difficult when a war is going on, because it's the most human thing to do, to go like that. But if the war goes on for years to come, it's of enormous importance that Ukrainians can speak openly and freely and with plurality about where they think their country is going and how they understand where their countries come from. And that will then play a huge role in Ukraine's chances of healthy sustenance of democratic institutions after the war is over, let's say in a scenario where Ukraine feels confident that there isn't just a peace but a permanent peace. So I think that it's important to begin thinking early about not just this transition that we mentioned now from a war that you hoped would be over to a war that's still going to go on for a while, but that other transition that feels a bit unreachable now, but it'll hopefully come, and hopefully in not too distant a future, when you have not just peace, but peace that will last, right? It's very important that is something you begin to think about now, because that transition for Ukraine will be as difficult as the war itself, in my opinion. So it's and that's why I'm always passionate when I'm sometimes asked as an outsider what kind of voices you like from Ukraine. I say I like more. It's not about what I like. I like a plurality, and I like a richer economy of discourse, and I like the country to develop a capacity to talk to itself without that being read off a single sort of script of what is correct to say in the time of war. It's a very difficult task, but it's incredibly important to Ukraine's sustenance of democracy after the war is over. And then perhaps one last point I would make for anybody who's addressing a Western audience specifically, it's important to follow currents of sentiment of Western citizens, because you want them to put some pressure on their governments to do more, as inevitably any Ukrainian would. And it's important to be really clued up to where they are at. And sometimes algorithms can mislead us about that. So, for example, one of the things that I've observed is that certain kinds of activism that exaggerated in favor of Ukraine were effective a year ago, half a year ago. Now they are effective with your audience on YouTube, but I believe that they might be less effective than they were before. That doesn't mean activism isn't effective. Activism is always effective. It's just a question of strategy and understanding your audience. Now, I'm free from this because I happen to support Ukraine in this war, but I'm not advocating for Ukraine. But I think following these trends of how Western society is reacting is really, really important. So, for instance, you might spend more time now talking about how Putin constitutes a threat to the West, if you are somebody who is a Ukrainian activist. And these adjustments, these forms of exhaustion that develop after people have been seeing a war from a big distance for a long time, all of that is worth following and paying attention to.
Being sensitive, like sensitive narrators and sensitive observers. Olha Tokarczuk in her Nobel Prize speech talks about this very accurate observation of the changes, minor changes that happen. Vlad, thank you so much for being you, for being a voice, a really strong, interesting voice telling many important things. Thank you for choosing Ukraine as being part of your thoughts, your emotions. And thank you for joining our today's conversation. I know that many of my subscribers are already your followers. I will leave the links below this video to many of your beautiful channels. And thank you so much for the stories and worlds and thoughts that you generously share with us.
Love and strength your way. Thanks for talking with me.
Thank you so much.